Hello friends, Rob Caskie, proudly telling stories, and I'm so glad you joined me on this journey together. I must tell you that the filming of these stories fills me with some angst and anxiety between the lighting, the microphone, a fan to keep me cool because I tend to perspire from nerves doing the filming. It's all quite something, along with moving furniture and moving for various places around our home and sometimes on the outside. And the editor who very kindly puts these videos together is Corin's oldest son, Rattray, whose ability with IT and everything computer related staggers me. But he does remind me quite often that to splice, to join videos, is quite difficult, and he would rather that I tell a story from start to finish in one hit with no interruptions, no breaks, no mistakes, hopefully no spoofs. And it's quite difficult to tell these stories by memory alone from start to finish without an or an ah, without a mistake, without a break. And I really hope that you're going to bear with me, because the opening phases of the Anglo-Boer War are intriguing. And I forgot to mention that in my last story about the events leading up to the ultimatum, there is that spark that lands in the powder keg. Well, isn't it interesting that in the city of Johannesburg, a boilermaker called Tom Edgar had got into a brawl in a bar. He had killed the man he was fighting with, and when the ZAPs, the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek Polisie, arrived to arrest him, Edgar was shot by a man called Jones. Now, with Edgar and Jones, I might just as well be talking about the Welshman who fought so bravely against the Zulus at Isandlwana. Nonetheless, here was a man who'd killed another in a bar brawl, and in due course was killed himself during his arrest by the ZAPs. Well, the Uitlanders and the Reform Committee in Johannesburg went absolutely crazy. And at the trial, the judge, a 26-year-old with the surname of Koch, mentioned that he thought that Jones had done his job incredibly well, and that the enthusiasm regarding the arrest of criminals and wrongdoers should not be diminished. Well, for the Uitlanders in the cities of Johannesburg and Pretoria, this was indeed outrageous. And the state attorney, Jan Smuts, was very, very upset at Koch's summation, because he felt that if the ZAPs did their job better, more calmly, less aggressively, they could indeed allay some of the Uitlanders' grievances without giving away any real power. But that incident is important in terms of your understanding to the build-up and the lead-up to the eventual issuing of the ultimatum by State Attorney Jan Smuts to the British governor in the Cape, Alfred Milner. Now, isn't it intriguing to consider that Winston Spencer Churchill, who features so prominently in British history, in his early days featured very prominently in a lot of campaigns around the world. I'm fortunate enough to often speak about, and I've been to the Sudan a number of times, speaking about the Sudanese campaign, the rise of the dervishes and the Mahdi, the death of General Gordon on the 25th of January of 1885, and eventually the retraining, the reorganization of the Anglo-Egyptian army under Wood and Wolseley and others in Egypt. And they would eventually reinvade the Sudan in 1898 under the leadership of Kitchener. And isn't it fascinating to consider that Churchill was there? Churchill was there with a charge of the 17th, 21st Lancers against the dervishes in the Kerreri Hills at Omdurman on the banks of the Nile. And the dervishes were brave enough to lie down in little undulations in the ground and let the charges charge over them of the 17th, 21st Lancers. And then they would jump up with swords and spears and indeed try and cut the hamstrings of the horses to get the horse down that they could deal with the rider. Well, Churchill was unsettled at Omdurman, and he was lucky enough to fight his way clear with his revolver. That was in September of 1898. Do you know that the following year, 1899, he was out here as a journalist with one of the British papers, the Morning Post, and indeed as an officer with a South African light horse. Very unusual combination, to be an officer in a time of war and a journalist or a reporter for a British paper. And when his mother expressed concern regarding Churchill coming out to fight for the British against the Boers, he answered his mother, he said, "Mother, have no fear. The gods would never have created so potent a being as myself for so prosaic an ending as to be killed by the Boers, perhaps with a Mauser bullet in the Anglo-Boer War." Confident man. Well, isn't it fascinating to consider that after the Battle of Ladysmith on the 30th of October of 1899, Mournful Monday, I mentioned that, Hamilton having convinced them not to fight on the Sunday, but to delay the attack to the Monday, becoming known as Mournful Monday. With it, the Boers promptly besieged the town of Ladysmith. All of its 12,000 strong garrison of British soldiers and all the citizens of the town. It would indeed be a siege that would run for 118 days, 4 full months. And trying to find out a little bit more about the siege and what was going on the periphery of the Boer siege around Ladysmith, there was often an armoured train that would travel up from the little town of Escort up to Freya, onwards from Freya to Chivli, from Chivli to Colenso, where the rail and the road bridge crossed the mighty Tugela River. Tuga in Zulu is to startle or frighten. Tugela is the biggest river in Natal and features very prominently in terms of Botha's defences against the British, who were trying to crack the siege of Ladysmith. Well, the captain in charge of the armoured train was a man called Elmer Haldane. Haldane was not all that keen on travelling on this particular day up to Colenso to see what was going on. And Churchill, who was so keen to be part of the action, so keen for news, so keen to write articles for the British papers, a man who perhaps would embellish the truth more than a little, convinced Haldane that they should make their way on the armoured train up to Chivli and perhaps beyond to Colenso to get some local intel, some local information, and then bumble back to Escort. Well, Haldane jumped off the train at Freya, which indeed was where Buller's camp would be when he arrived with the Natal field force, and he ran into the little station office at the station siding to send a message back to Escort that he was in Freya and proceeding further up the line. And if he'd waited 2 minutes, he would have got a response from Escort to say, "Do not proceed. There has been considerable Boer activity found not far from the railway line, north and indeed east of Freya." Haldane, having sent his message, jumps back on the train and tells him to proceed. Well, the armoured train was a very interesting arrangement. It was called the Hairy Mary because the locomotive was covered with thick rope to try and deflect or absorb rifle fire. In front of it, it had 3 carriages, and behind it, the locomotive, another 3 carriages. So 6 carriages. The locomotive in the middle, called the Hairy Mary. The carriages were given some fortification by way of sandbags on their outer periphery, and they carried a cannon, a small mountain gun on one of those carriages. There were roughly 160 men on the train, including Churchill, and off they go from Freya up towards Chivli. And on the railway line between Freya and Chivli is a very sharp right-hand bend if you're travelling north, a very sharp left-hand bend if you're travelling south on the railway line. And they chug up the line with the locomotive, the Hairy Mary pushing them along and putting the other 3 carriages all the way up to Chivli. There's nothing major to be seen, and they then decide to turn and head back to Escort. It's early morning. There'd been some early morning mist in the valleys, and as they begin to come down a gentle incline towards that sharp bend in the railway line, they were fired upon by a Krupp gun from the hills just north of the railway line. Well, the train driver, the locomotive driver, out of necessity, and I think as a natural human response, would give the locomotive steam to try and accelerate to get away from the Boer fire. The Boers, having watched the train advanced northwards up towards Chivley and beyond, had descended off the hills and had put rocks on the inside railway track in an attempt to derail the train. And when the train accelerated, it was exactly the response they wanted. And when those carriages hit the rocks on the inside line, it would indeed flick the first carriage right off the track. The next two ended up blocked on the track. The Hairy Mary and the remaining three carriages came to an abrupt halt, as you can imagine. And with it, the Boers pour fire into them, with their Krupp gun and their Mausers firing into the carriages. The men are trying to take cover behind the carriages and fire back. One of the Krupp shells hit their mountain gun, destroying it completely and rendering it useless for anything further in the fight. Well, in the abrupt stop, the locomotive driver had hit his head very badly in the cab of the locomotive. Blood was pouring down his face. And Churchill was urging him, brave man that he was, to fire up the locomotive and to shunt the carriages in front of the locomotive to get them off the track that they could race back to Freya and onwards to escort. Well, the train driver was being very uncooperative, and Churchill said to him in a rather calm way, lightning never strikes the same place twice. And the locomotive driver is now ramming the trucks in front of him to get them off the track. The first truck, you remember, has been thrown right off the track, and eventually they would get the locomotive moving, pulling the remaining two carriages back towards Freya and escort, with Churchill and others running alongside of the train on the offside from the Boer fire. Well, some of them left it too long, including Churchill. As the train gathered momentum, it was eventually going too fast for these men to jump onto the train. Some took cover in any long grass or reed beds they could find near the railway line, while the Boers descended off the hill and calmly rounded them up, including Churchill. Now, Churchill had a very pale complexion and reddish hair, which is not ideal for our big yellow ball in this country. You know, the British visitors come out here praying for sunshine, and as David Rattray often reminded them, it was the wrong prayer, because their epidermis and their whole physiology is not well suited to our South African sun. And Churchill had lost his hat in the ambush and the attack on the train, and the sun was beginning to treat him rather harshly. And as they were being marched back to Colenso and onwards to Ladysmith to catch a train to Pretoria as prisoners of war, Churchill calmly took a little notepad out of his pocket and a pencil, and he wrote his name and the date on this piece of paper, Winston Spencer Churchill, 15th of November 1899, and gave it to his captor, who was riding a horse alongside of him. Well, the captor's name was Goss. The Goss family farm up at Magut. They are professional hunting trainers and professional hunters, and they still have that little piece of paper given by Churchill at the time of his capture to Goss, who was one of the Boer captors of the armoured train. Well, Churchill managed to escape. His place of incarceration was a school with a barbed wire fence around it, a prisoner of war camp, glorious name. He managed to escape out of a window, through the fence, and he tells us in his memoirs that he forded the mighty Arpies River. Well, the Arpies River is literally a trench. Even when it's full, it's little more than a tiny stream. Fording it is a direct embellishment of the truth by Churchill. He then hid in disused mine shafts. He hid in a coal truck on a train, finding his way from Pretoria out eastwards, eventually down to Lorenzo Marx, where he caught a steamer back down to Durban, got onto the steps of the City Hall, gave a rousing speech about the war effort and his part in it, and how keen he was to return to the front. And with that, this brave young man, remember his comment, the gods would never have created so potent a being as myself for so prosaic an ending. He headed back to the front for more dramas and more adventures in the main Anglo-Boer War. I hope you'll continue with me on the storytelling journey. Thank you very much.